Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. My name is Jeremy Segal, and you're listening to the Why Influence podcast, where we interview influencers about their why and their motivations for influencing. You may be wondering, who's this Jeremy Segal? Why did he start a podcast? And why should I listen? And that's what this episode's all about. If you want to jump into listening to interviews with influencers, then I suggest that you start listening to the most recent episodes and working your way back. But other than that, let's just jump into it. I'm starting this podcast as a passion project. I'm really excited about where it's going to go. I'm excited about the guests that I've already had on the show, which I'm about 7 episodes in as of recording this. I've interviewed YouTube influencers ranging from 10 to 15,000 subscribers up to over 1 million subscribers. And I've interviewed podcasters, Instagram influencers, and it's only been about 7 episodes. I'm looking forward to what future guests I'm going to bring on the show and all the content that I'm going to bring you guys for you guys to learn about. And above all, I'm looking forward to inspiring people who haven't shared and have a lot of wisdom and knowledge to start sharing. And if you do that as a result of listening to this podcast, I would love for you to reach out and let me know your story and let me know what's going on. And maybe we'll even bring you on the show here. What can you expect from a typical episode? Basically, the flow is going to be asking about the influencer's backgrounds, how they got into it, why they got into it, what some of the big early successes were, what were some of the struggles that they've had, how did they overcome those struggles. They'll be sharing tips and tricks to help you get started or things that they're doing that really differentiate themselves from other influencers that really give them an edge. So it'll be a deep dive into the why with some how components brought into it. So if you want to jump right in and start listening to influencer interviews, then I suggest you start the most recent interview and work your way back. And you can do that now. If you want to learn a little bit more about my story and where I came from and how I got to where I am today, then I have my friend Nathan, who is going to be interviewing me for the rest of this episode. So he'll be extracting my stories for you guys to listen to.
Welcome to the Why Influence podcast, where we deep dive into the why behind some of the world's most influential people. Why do you influence? Why are you an influencer? We hope to inspire you to share your voice with the world. And now, your host, Jeremy Segal.
So I know why you're starting this podcast, Jeremy, but why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about why you're doing this podcast?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I feel like everybody has some level of wisdom and knowledge that can be shared with the world. And I've built up some self-awareness around this recently as I've gotten a lot of success through entrepreneurship, and I've helped a lot of people go through a lot of hard issues and technical issues, and was able to help them on a large level and help them take leaps in mindsets just through a short conversation. And I feel like I've accumulated all of this knowledge and wisdom, but I'm not sharing it with the world. I'm only sharing it with people that I physically interact with. And I'm not posting on social media. I'm not posting online. I'm not even really calling friends or texting very much with people. I just interact with who I interact with, and that's who gets my influence.
But you want to spread that influence. You want more people to be able to get access to the things you've learned over the years?
Yeah, I want other people to be able to have access to that. But on top of that, I mean, building a podcast around entrepreneurship is definitely a strong suit of mine. But this is a podcast about influence and why you should influence. And that I think I have more passion for, which is there's a lot of other people out there like me who are either introverted or don't share online or share with their friends or influence people. And they have tons of knowledge and wisdom that is being lost or just not being shared. And I think that there's a lot of power in helping influence those people to start influencing in a way.
I love that, because I think all of us need a little bit of encouragement, but being able to see somebody who's struggling with that part a little bit themselves advance and get better, I think is going to be amazing. But the thing is I know you from a high level mastermind group that we go to in Atlanta, and you got up a couple months ago now, and gave a talk a little bit about your history. And, because you're so quiet and not necessarily the most outspoken in that group of very outspoken people, when you got up and gave your talk, we were blown away by your history as an entrepreneur and the things you've accomplished. Now, I know about one story that I definitely want to get into, But real quick, if you would give us just a brief synopsis so we can understand like who you are as an entrepreneur. Can you give us a synopsis of the things you've gone through, the different things you've tried?
Yeah, I mean, I've started a bunch of different things throughout my life. I've always known I wanted to be an entrepreneur from a young age. And I chose my college degrees to chase the job of the chief financial officer because I saw that as having the skill set that I felt was necessary to be a successful entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I didn't really become an entrepreneur in my eyes until I was able to be a CFO, but I've always had the mindset. I mean, as far back as kindergarten, I was selling erasers to friends for a nickel. Middle school, I was selling Pokemon cards online. I was selling stuff off Walmart shelves and selling them on eBay. And when I sold, I would get my parents to drive me to Walmart so that we could go buy what I sold on eBay until I sold stuff that was out of stock. And then I had to like contact people and say, hey, sorry, don't have this in stock. And I stopped doing that. But, I've always had this mindset in high school, college, was buying, selling, flipping cars, stuff on Craigslist, just generic stuff. I started a couple e-commerce websites, sold paracord bracelets. We got up to about $3,500 in sales a month on paracord bracelets. Started a paint pigment website and a Halloween mask product and drone business that I built and eventually sold. And then I've got a car dealership.
And so interestingly enough, how many of these businesses and how many of these ventures from selling erasers on, how many of these things did you do before you started as a CFO?
The only ones I did after the CFO were the drone business. It was back when the DJI Phantom original came out. So after I left the CFO position, I was like, I need an idea to start my entrepreneurial journey now that I unlocked this barrier in my mind and got the skills and knowledge that I wanted.
That's the thing I want to talk about now is that barrier, because clearly you've been an entrepreneur your whole life. You've had the mindset of an entrepreneur, but until you reached a certain point, you said this is what makes an entrepreneur. So talk to us a little bit about when you got past that barrier. It was working as the chief financial officer for this company. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. I always aspired to be the CFO of a company. That was my step one to my entrepreneurial journey. And so I got my degree in accounting and finance. I got my master's in information system. I started out at Ernst & Young, a large accounting firm. And then I moved on to doing implementations for cloud accounting software for companies that outgrew QuickBooks, implementing it's called Intact and NetSuite. And from there, I got this opportunity to be a CFO of a 130 employee, about $25 million business. And I was in charge of the accounting, finance, HR, marketing, and IT departments with direct reports. And it was just a really big learning experience for me. I mean, I was basically running the business side of this business. And I did that by the time I was 25 years old. I was CFO.
Yeah. So just more proof that you've been an entrepreneur your whole life. But what were you able to achieve at this business? What were you able to do for them?
So I sort of assessed their business over the first couple months that I was there. And I put together this master plan, is sort of what I called it. And the business had 5 different partners. And once I was able to get all 5 partners together for a partner meeting, I brought my plan there and presented it to them. When I presented to them at the end of it, they said, oh, wow, this is the best meeting we've had in the 20-something years we've been in business, and we're excited to move forward with it. And pretty much just said, here's how you can save about $1.2 million a year in like recurring savings. Here's how you can grow your business with better marketing. Here's how you should just fix your business, basically, and get it on the track of scaling it up, essentially. Going into it, the business is a little bit difficult to implement because you have 5 partners and one partner can call you and be like, hey, can you put a hold on this item? Another partner calls you and say, hey, what's the status of that item? Well, the other partner said to put a hold on it. And it's like, well, I didn't agree to that. And it's like, well, you guys don't communicate. I was 100% gung-ho to like implement this plan, and my drive just sort of started deteriorating when I just got roadblocks here, roadblocks there, roadblocks there. I did a big impact while I was there, and I left the plan in place as I transitioned out smoothly and on good terms with them. Since then, they've actually implemented the entire plan since I left. But, from there, that's when I started my entrepreneurial journey, was after that.
Well, that's not exactly where you started your entrepreneurial journey. You started that since you were in like kindergarten. That's when it sounds like you gave yourself permission to be an entrepreneur, even though you've been one this whole time.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's really important. I mean, that's really interesting to me because now you have this podcast that you're starting around influence, and you yourself aren't very social. You've told me in your social one-on-one in some small groups. Right now, what is your influence? How much are you on social? What's your following like? Who are you as an influencer right now?
Yeah, basically, I've got influence through my car dealership. I've built about 180,000 combined followers through the dealership, but none of that has anything about me or my personality or anything about me in it. It's my business's brand. So I've built that up. As far as personal brand, I have a LinkedIn because that's important for entrepreneurship. I've got about 500 connections on there. I don't post on there until recently. I've posted probably 3 to 5 times in the past month. But before that, I've had 0 posts and activity. And I've got a Facebook personal, just maybe 100 to 200 friends, something like that. And I very rarely post in there. I posted on there probably about 3 to 4 months ago. And my post got 1 comment, and it was from a friend I haven't talked to in over 3 years. And he just said, and I quote, "Dang, you're still on Facebook?" You know, like I have 0 activity generally on these platforms, so little that when I do post, people are just like, "Wow, this guy's still alive," you know? I don't have a personal Twitter. I created one but never used it. And same with Instagram. Don't have a personal Instagram. So I'm very off social media from a personal standpoint.
I can really relate to that. I've just now started to try and build my sphere of influence for the same reason that I feel like I've got a message that I need to get out there. But here's what's interesting to me is you've been able to build a following and an influence, but just you didn't do it for yourself. You were able to do it for your business and for your car dealership. And so you have this huge following. You know how to build influence, but you've been, it seems like, intentionally removing yourself from the face of that influence. And I know you've got a couple of stories about that. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm more than just like a typical introvert who's running a business. What I call it intentionally behind the scenes introvert, which is instead of just being behind the scenes and getting things done, I'm making sure that I'm in nothing. Like my face isn't in anything, my personality isn't anything. When I first started the car dealership, we made a media splash and ABC Action News contacted us, and I actually contacted a friend to come be the person of the business to be interviewed for the piece because I didn't want to be in it. And the same thing goes into the content for all the social media that I post. Is I always put an image over my face, or if I'm in it too much, like I'll just not use the content. If I want to get a point across, I have to find workaround ways to get that point across without me being in it. So it's sort of held me back from, I think, making more powerful stories with my business's brands, but it's just something that I always did that was very behind the scenes, I guess, or just intentionally behind the scenes.
That can be challenging, right? Because businesses do well with an attractive character with the face of the business. And so that means you're right now on the cusp of a huge transition. So, but I know that you've put in a ton of work to get to the point where you're ready to become an influencer, and you're starting at ground zero with a passion to help people. And that's something that's interesting in knowing you. You've had tons of financial success with pretty much every venture you've tried, and your financial success grew a lot after you gave yourself permission to be an entrepreneur, right? Your ventures were bigger and more lucrative. But it's interesting because you've got this car dealership and you're importing these awesome Japanese sports cars and GTRs and Supras, and it's really awesome. So a lot of people that might think that because you got into accounting and you saved people all this money and you've made all this money yourself, that money's super important to you. But that's not the case, is it? That's not your main driver.
So I've got a lot of instances where I've made decisions to sacrifice on money or income for more impact or change, either on myself or for others. When I started my career, I started at Ernst & Young as a big accounting firm and a nice salary coming out of college. And my next job after that, I took a $20K pay cut. And then my next job after that, I took a $25K pay cut. And I took these giant pay cuts so that I could get the experience that I wanted. And the jobs that I was working in were jobs that required 15 plus years experience to even get interviewed with. And I'm trying to get that experience, but the only way to get to it is basically to volunteer. That kind of mindset is something that I've used a lot in my journey, is just sort of not really chasing the money, I'm chasing the impact. And a lot of my businesses they've made people happy or helped find unique solutions to make life easier or things of that nature. I'm very opposed to having a business or people that have businesses that I view in my eyes as being unethical.
Okay. This is really exciting to me because I don't know that I've ever come across an opportunity like this where I can follow somebody from the ground up while you go from virtually 0 followers and personal influence and just see what you can accomplish with the same strategic outlook that you took when you dropped $20,000, took a pay cut to strategically get the position you wanted. You've made these moves and you've looked strategically at your plan, and then you have this knack for spotting trends. And that's the thing at the mastermind group that we as a group are trying to figure out. How does this one person just see all these different trends and be able to act on them successfully? And so it's just really interesting because you're a person that has a history of success, and you could share that success with us and you can teach that. And you told me that you're going to share a bunch of that stuff with us, but it's really cool because you're starting from ground zero and showing us how a successful person would start from ground zero and build themselves, build their influence while helping people. And so that's really exciting to me. And so I don't know that leads into a question, but I just wanted to let you know that's.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, man, that's really exciting. And I think for us, for the audience that's listening, we really need to understand that the opportunity that we have when we're listening to you going forward. And so I think that's amazing. And maybe now's a good time. Can you tell us a little bit about what we can expect from your podcast?
First of all, I mean, the podcast is based around interviewing influencers about their why. So we'll get the passions and the motivations behind why influencers are influencing. And then we'll learn struggles that they've gone through their journeys. We'll learn tips and tricks that they've used that have given them success in the influence. Aside from that, you'll have me sort of as an avatar that you can watch, that going from very intentionally behind the scenes introvert to someone who has the power to maybe change or influence you. You know, I'm going through this. Now I'm drawing a blank.
No, it's all good. I mean, you're going through this journey, and it's all new for you. And so I think that's important for people to understand that even if you've been successful, sometimes you got to get out of your comfort zone and try something new. If you really want to grow, and if you really want to impact and be influential, you're going to have to get outside your comfort zone. So I understand drawing a blank sometimes because this is all new for you. And so let's talk a little bit about why is it for me, like listening to your podcast, what am I going to get when you talk to these influencers and you're asking them why and you're asking about your struggles? What do I get out of it?
Well, it depends on where you're at. I mean, it sounds like you're on the journey of starting your influence. So you'll be hearing what drives other people. So maybe it can be motivation to help you get started or help you keep going. And then it could be giving you some wisdom so that when you encounter some of these potential struggle points that other people have encountered, such as, say, lack of motivation at times, because influence can be draining from creating so much content, and some of the strategies that the influencers have used to overcome these struggles. And then also tips and tricks such as, you know, maybe you want to gain a bunch of Twitter followers or gain a bunch of Instagram followers. And, you know, when you're listening to a specific influencer in that space, they'll be able to give you some really deep dive insights into strategies that you could use to apply to what you're doing.
Oh, man, that's exciting. There's a lot of value in that. So another thing is that I know another one of your motivators is to build a community. So why don't you talk to that? Why don't you talk to us a little bit about the kind of community you want to build, or what's important about building a community?
Sure. So one reason I'm doing the podcast, aside from what we've talked about, is to build a community. And I thought a lot about what kind of communities that I would like to build. And I sort of narrowed it down to either entrepreneurs or influencers. And most of my friends today are either longtime friends that I've been friends with through just life experiences, or more recent friends are going to be majority entrepreneurs because they have more flexible lifestyles and generally think outside the box, and I just have a little bit more in common usually. And, you know, we can find more instances to hang out because it's not always just hanging out on the weekends or nights. If you have a flexible lifestyle, it could be hang out during the day, but then you're working on a weekend, that kind of thing. But as far as differentiating between entrepreneurs and influencers, after quite a bit of just reflection on it, I found that in general, this is not something that applies to everybody at all, but it is just a very generalization that I've observed, is that entrepreneurs are generally driven by money. Even though they may have their purposes and stuff, they need to make a living. And then once they make a living, they want to make a bigger living generally. And so entrepreneurs are generally driven by making money, whereas influencers a lot of times can be struggling and still doing it and being motivated to do it, or maybe making it, but they're making it because they're fulfilling some kind of purpose. And it's the making it part is sort of secondary thing that comes. And money is not necessarily the first drive for most influencers that I've talked to so far, at least. It's something else. And that's what the podcast is about, is extracting that something else and figuring out what these motivations are and why they're doing it.
I love that. And I can definitely adopt that. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur in a lot of ways, and you want to be an entrepreneur. And I think for a lot of us, it can start by being driven by the money. And then at some point, it's about the impact and it's about something else. So I love your distinction between, you're just saying that for this podcast, the reason that you're focusing on influencers is because they want more. They want to help people. They want to have impact. And I just love that distinction.
Yeah. And creating a podcast or creating any kind of social presence, really, I mean, if you did a YouTube channel or did anything, you're going to generally build a community in that space. Some podcasters have podcasts about real estate, or they'll have it on computer programming or the universe or whatever. By creating that podcast or that influence, they're going to be interacting with other people in that community. It's just an inherent thing that happens. And I think it's good that before launching something like that, you reflect on what kind of community you want to interact with, because that's going to be something that you'll encounter over time.
So everyone needs to hear that. I think that's really important, because if you're starting out right now, you need to think about the community that you want to be a part of and the community that you want to build, because that's one of the best parts about influencing, about getting out there, is you get to surround yourself by the people that you choose. I think that's really important, and I think it's really powerful. And again, that's us being able to learn from your strategic, future-looking outlook that I know I don't have as nearly as much as you do. So I love to see how you think about things and plan and strategize for the impact, for the influence, and for the future. I think that's really awesome. But let's really kind of talk about an example of your journey and the value. And as we know, you're an introvert, and I'm an extrovert, but I'm still struggling with trying to build up my influence in my community. I want to talk a little bit about where you are and how we're going to go through this process.
Sure. Basically, I'll be starting with the podcast. I'm not really planning to go big with it and do a bunch of, stories on Instagram or Snapchat or Facebook or YouTube. I guess everything has stories nowadays. But I'm basically going to be just primarily doing the podcast to start. That's my entry point. It's something that I can feel a little bit more comfortable with starting with. I'm not going to be sitting there in front of a camera. I'm not going to be standing in front of an audience, talking in front of big crowds. There may be an audience that comes, but right now I can assume that nobody's listening, or maybe a couple people, and sort of just going from there. I mean, it's just starting with the podcast. I'm going to start simple and start small. And right now my head's sort of kept down. I'm not looking up. I'm not like thinking, how am I going to make money from this? I'm just thinking, I want to get to 30 episodes. And that's just my goal right now. Don't even want to look up. I don't want anyone to like try to sponsor it. I don't want anything. I just want to get to having 30 interviews that I've successfully gone through and published on the podcast, and then just sort of go from there.
I think that's really important too, because you're setting a goal that you have control over, and you're putting your head down so that you're not taken off track, so that you're not pulled away from somebody sponsoring or from somebody's comment, because you're trying to do something from within. You're trying to do something for yourself. And so you're putting goals around it that you're in control of, right? Interview 30 people, keep my head down and do this part of it. And so for anybody that's looking to step outside of their comfort zone and do something that they're not sure exactly how it's going to turn out, I think it's really important to set a stretch goal that you are in control of. And so I love that you have that 30 podcast goal. That's really awesome. And so how should we listen to this podcast, right? So we're going to go along with you on your adventure. We're starting here with you, and you're at this point where you've got, virtually zero personal influence. But you have all these stories, all this history, and all this innate talent and abilities that we're going to be applying to this process. And I get to follow along and see how you're doing it so I can do it too. So how do I do that? What's the best way for me to follow along and do this with you?
I mean, it's mostly going to be just subscribing and staying in touch with what's going on. So it'd be both to the podcast itself and subscribing to it and listening to the episodes as they come out, and also subscribing to the newsletter, because as new announcements come out, or maybe I expand to doing more than the podcast at some time in the future, I can send out an announcement through that means and keep you updated with that.
That's awesome, Jeremy. Well, is there anything else that we should know? Is there anything else that we should expect, get excited about? What else can you leave us with?
I wanted to talk a little bit about unintended consequences.
Please do. I forgot to ask you about that. And I really want you to talk to us about the power of unintended consequences.
All right. So I'm a big advocate of unintended consequences, as in you never know what's going to happen from something that you do. And quick story about that is one of my previous businesses was making these masks. They're pretty cool masks. I would take heat sensitive paint pigments and mix them with a clear base and then paint them onto fabric and then cut and sew them to fit on your head. So they're this mask that has this heat sensitive paint on your face. And as you breathe, it changes to clear when it's heated and then cools and turns back to its color. So when you breathe out, it's turning clear. You breathe in, it turns back to its color, and it's got this constant changing effect on your face. And I was selling them at Comic Cons. I went to Halloween conventions, got them in Halloween stores. I had a website. I sold them all over the US and to dozens of other countries internationally. At the time, I didn't see myself as an entrepreneur that we talked about because I wasn't a CFO at the time. But when I first started it, we hit over $10,000 in sales the first month, and it was just sort of a business that came out. And through this journey of creating this business, I was at the New York Comic Con, which is one of the second largest Comic Con at the time in the country. And we had a booth, and I was selling masks there. And some kid comes up and pulls me aside and says, "Hey, can I talk to you real quick?" And I was thinking, well, this guy probably bought one of his masks. Like, what's wrong with it? Is the sew stitching off? Was the paint not applied right? Is it not working for whatever reason? And it wasn't any of those things. He actually started going to a story about how his best friend has one of my masks and how his best friend loved it so much. It was his favorite thing. He brought it with him everywhere he went. And at the time, his friend had it in the glove box of his car. And while his friend was driving one night, his friend got in a really bad car accident. And what he found was there's nobody around. So he was just sitting there in his car, and he was actually bleeding to death out of his arm. So what he did was he went to his glove box, he grabbed the mask, he tied it around his arm and slowed the bleeding. And he actually slowed the bleeding just enough to stay alive until the ambulance arrived. And it's sort of weird to think that a mask can save someone's life, but you never know what kind of things can come out of what you're doing. And it was powerful to me to hear the story because it's like, man, it not only made this guy happy, he loved this mask, he brought it with him everywhere he went, but at some point it actually saved his life just because he had it around him. And I think about that, and I think about, well, what other unintended consequences have my businesses have had over the years? Like with my car dealership, I've done quite a few interviews with customers, but we've got a lot more customers than I have interviews, so I don't really hear all their stories. And then, what kind of unintended consequences can come when I start sharing my journey online or trying to inspire other people to do things that they're passionate about? And I'm looking forward to that.
Well, first of all, that's just an amazing, awesome story because you don't know. You have no idea. I mean, you were just making masks. You were just making masks. You weren't trying to make people happy, trying to be fun. You had no intention of saving somebody's life, yet that happened. And so, man, you have no idea. We have no idea what the ripple effect of the thing that we're doing is. But one thing's for sure is that when you go out into the world with the intention to help people, with the intention to make people happy, when you can go out in the world like that, there's going to be a positive impact. And for me personally, that makes me it motivates me even more to step into this journey, to be more of an influencer, to get my message out to people. Because, like, how do I know who needs to hear that message and who needs to hear it today, not tomorrow, right? Not in a week, but they need to hear it right now. And so, man, if your mask can save a life, then what can words and stories with the intent to save lives, what can that do? It's pretty exciting.
Thanks.
So, we talked about community and how you're building a community. But this journey for influence, like even though this podcast is in pre-launch, just putting your energy towards it and just committing and doing this thing that's out of your comfort zone, it's opened up some doors for you, hasn't it?
Yeah, it actually has.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about the doors that it's opened up for you?
At this point of recording this episode, I've actually done 6 interviews with influencers so far. And we didn't talk about it actually earlier, but the first 3 interviews that we did, re-recorded myself over myself for all those interviews because I was stumbling through my words, not finding myself saying the things I wanted to say in the right way. And it didn't affect the interviewee. So they actually said some really powerful stuff throughout the interview. But I found that I didn't really like how I sounded in it. And I gave myself permission before starting the podcast that I was allowed to do that for my first 3 episodes. And then after that, I'm not allowed to do it. And it was a good learning experience to do that for the first 3 episodes because I saw what I didn't like about how I was interacting. I was able to do it the way that I wanted to do it. And then that helped me through my other interviews. And I feel like now I just have to accept with making mistakes and being vulnerable as far as doing my interviews. So that's sort of unrelated. But as far as the community goes, well, the fact is I interviewed 6 people so far. And, I didn't really have 6 powerful influence.
If we can we go back to that? Because I think that's really important. I don't want to fully gloss over it because we should have probably talked about it earlier because you're so far out of your comfort zone and you're doing something new. So basically, it sounds like you gave yourself permission to mess up in the beginning and you were going to correct those mistakes so you could learn from them. But then from that point, you pick 3 as a number. You're going to let yourself do it for the first 3. And then after that, you're going to have to take what you learned and you're going to have to learn through just doing it and the hard knocks of it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. And actually, the very first one I did twice. So I did a test one just to go through the process, and then I did a real one and recorded that. So I had a test episode, and then the first 3 I was willing to spend the time to re-record myself. And you have 2 audio tracks, and I didn't talk that much because it's an interview style, and then I can add in my intro outro where I talk more. But I just would re-say the question the way I wanted to say it, or maybe during the interview I said, "Oh, well, I liked what you said about this," and then ask the next question, but I would just say it more clearly and more confidently and more concisely.
That's really good. And so I'm going to encourage the listeners to listen to the first 3 and the second and the next 3, right? Listen to these first 6 and see the difference, right? And it probably in some ways is going to sound better in the first 3 because you took that time. And then I'm going to be really curious to go back and look when you're in episode 15, 16, and when you finally get to 30, to see the difference of starting now and the first 3 you had to edit out to where you become over those 30. And I think for anyone trying to extend their influence and learn to do something new, I think that's super powerful. But then I interrupted you to talk about that, but we were also going to talk about what were the doors that it opened, right? You're building this community of influencers and awesome people that want to have an impact. But what are some of the doors that having a podcast and making this decision, what are some of the doors that opened?
Yeah, I mean, when I started the podcast, I didn't have 6 people to interview. I had maybe 1 or 2, and then I have a few more in mind that I haven't reached out to yet. But most of these have come through either referrals or through approaching people and saying, "Hey, I've got a podcast. Do you want to come on it?" And you may approach someone. Before this, if I interacted with one of these influencers, I may have had nothing to say or no way to really interact or have a follow-up with one of these people. But because I have the podcast, I can say, "Hey, I've got this podcast where I interview influencers. I'd love to bring you on the show. Would you be willing to come on and talk about your why and your motivation?" And I'm able to get some large influencers. I interviewed Philip from the Advisors Show TV. He's got over 1 million subscribers and over 400 million YouTube views. That's a pretty big influencer in my eyes. And I've got a couple other big ones in the pipeline, and I like doing the small ones too because it's a whole journey through the process. But it's definitely opened doors. I mean, I haven't even launched the podcast. I'm approaching these people just saying I have a podcast and was able to land these first 6. And that's without having a website to send them to, without saying, "Hey, here, listen to the sample episode, see what you can expect to talk about." None of that's there. So I'm interested to see how that changes over time when I have more established podcast and people can see that there's content on there and some influencers that I've already interviewed on there, maybe ones that they're familiar with.
there's one influencer that you unlock the door, but it's going to take the audience and the listeners to open it up all the way, right? And this is super exciting and something that a lot of people wouldn't think to do. But you contacted a very influential individual and set up a challenge. And the only way that we can fully open this door is if the audience members, if we can help you to open this door. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. I was able to spend one day at Podfest in Orlando, and I interacted with some of the other podcasters there. And I met JLD, John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire, which is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I'm not that familiar, but he's one of the biggest podcasters out there. He's interviewed over 2,100 entrepreneurs at this point. He's got a ton of episodes, and he posts an interview every day for several years. I approached him and talked with him, had small talk. He was an awesome guy, and a quick selfie with him. And then after leaving and driving home at the end of the day, I was thinking to myself, this guy is one of the biggest guys in the community. He did the opening keynote. He's just a really big guy in this podcasting community, and I would love to bring him on the show, but I don't even have a podcast that's live. And at this time, I didn't even have one interview that I'd done. And so I tried to think of something because I knew that his memory of me would sort of fade away over time. And that night, what I did is I took my camera out, I took a selfie video and just reminded him about our conversation. And I told him to challenge me. I told him I had zero social following, essentially, and I'm starting this podcast. What goal can he challenge me with that if I hit that goal a year from now, then he'll come on the show as a guest? And I sent him an email with the selfie picture of me and him attached and a link to the video. And he actually replied, and he said, 2,500 listens, you got this. And so that's my goal right now. I've got my goal of hitting 30 episodes, and then I have my goal that a year from now, I need to hit an average of 2,500 listens per episode so I can get this guy to come on my podcast.
Oh, man. All right. So there's your heads down goal that you're in full control of. And then there's the other goal that we have to help you with. So hopefully everyone will share this podcast and get some value and share it wherever they share awesome news, because that is, man, if we can just kind of think about that, number one, for me, that would be super scary to even do that. And then for you, like, here's somebody who specifically tried to not record themselves, not be on video, and then you put yourself out there and you recorded a video for the top, probably the most influential podcaster, one of the most influential podcasters in the world, certainly in the top 5. So hopefully everyone will chip in and help you get him on here, because I would love to hear the story come full circle.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's it. That's the end of the episode. Big shout out to Nathan. Thanks so much for helping me out on this episode by being the guest host and interviewing me for my story. Thanks to you guys for sticking around. 40 minutes is a long time to stick around and listen to my story, so I appreciate that. Please check out some of the other episodes that we have coming out. We have some really awesome influencers who are sharing some really deep stories. If you want to help me out, the best thing you can do is leave me an iTunes review and then put a comment or some feedback in the comments section of the review. If you have some constructive criticism or negative comments, then please leave a good review and then just put those comments or feedback points in the comment of the review. That way that the review is still good and then the comment can get the point across. That way I can make future episodes taking your feedback and making it more aligned with the kind of episodes that you would like to listen to. The reason why reviews are very important, it's because they allow us to bring on bigger and better influencers. The more reviews that we get, the better the reviews that we get, the bigger and better the guests that we can get. We're counting on you guys, the listeners, to help us by giving these reviews. That way we can bring in the people that you guys want. I'd love for you guys to reach out into your networks. If you know somebody who's an influencer who you think is a good fit for coming on the show, then please, by all means, tell them about the show, have them contact me, or you contact me and make an introduction. whatever you can do to bring more people into our community. I would love for any referrals that you guys have. If there's anybody that you follow that you want to come on the show, then feel free to leave comments on their media, post on Instagram, post on their YouTube videos, or reach out to them directly and just bring them on the show. I'll bring them on here and I'll find out their why and share it with you guys. So if there's people that you follow, friends that you have that you want them to share their why, then just push them this way and we'll make it happen. But all I ask is that you don't forget to go on there and leave us a review. And if you don't have access to leaving a review on iTunes, then leave a review wherever you can, if it's Stitcher or Google or wherever. All those reviews are very important. I read every single one of them. They're very valuable to growing this podcast. The best way to stay in touch with this podcast is to subscribe to the podcast and also subscribe to the newsletter. You can go to our website, www.whyinfluence.com, whyinfluence.com, and at the bottom of the homepage, you can subscribe to the newsletter. If you're already an influencer, keep on influencing. I hope this podcast is able to bring you motivation, tips, tricks, whatever it takes to gain and grow your influence. If you're not an influencer, but you have a lot of wisdom and knowledge that could be shared with the world, then I hope this podcast will be enough to inspire you over time to start influencing and sharing some of that knowledge with the world. Thanks so much for listening to the Why Influence podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.